getting the exposure to grow your small wedding business can be difficult. With millions of engaged couples using The Knot to plan their weddings and find vendors, advertising on our sites will connect you with more couples than anywhere else online. Meet engaged couples where they're already searching for vendors like you, and let us deliver leads to help you grow your business. Visit vendors.thenot.com/podcast to sign up today. Mention code podcast15 during your free onboarding session for 15% off your first month.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast. Episode 384, Jonathan Sandler comes on to talk about his graphic novel, The English GI, a Yorkshire schoolboy's adventures in the U.S. and Europe. Jonathan Sandler comes on the show to talk about his graphic novel of his grandfather's experiences during the war. Mr. Sandler has long been keen on World War II and graphic novels, and now his grandfather's memoir has allowed him to bring these two passions together. Mr. Sandler, thank you very much for being with us today.
Please call me Jonathan. Thanks you for having me, Ray. I'm honored to be on this podcast.
Absolutely, very much. And now I have to tell you, this is the second graphic novel that I've interviewed for World War II. In your opinion, have you seen this before? Is this something that might be an increased trend as we go along? I'm just kind of curious what your experience is.
So it's funny you say that. When I embarked on this project, and we'll come into it in a bit more detail, I did do the Googling World War II and graphic novel to see what was out there.
Right.
And you may have, the absolutely seminal piece is Mouse, which is about the Holocaust, written by Art Spiegelman. I don't know if you've read that, but there was another book that was written quite recently by George Takei about Japanese internment in World War II in the US and his own experiences. George Takei is from Star Trek, and I bought that book. It was quite, the art was great. And there's been many other. I've now become a bit of a collector of World War II graphic novels, as you do. But what was the book that's the other book that you've that was on this podcast?
Oh, Joe Lee did the story of two sisters who were trapped in Warsaw. Oh, I'm trying to remember now. I think it's been close to a year now. But if you look up artist Joe Lee, I think it would pop up there.
Definitely. We'll do that.
But yeah, nice. So I was just wondering, I wanted to ask, so because it's battle, it's such a visual thing, I would think that there would be more graphic novels, to take advantage of the medium and that kind of thing as well. But as we're going to see in your book, yes, you can have pictures, yes, you can have drawings, but the words still help convey the emotions that arise while reading the story.
Absolutely. This book came about, so I suppose, why was it, did I do a graphic novel?
Right.
That's the principal question I even ask myself sometimes. No, my son had a huge interest in World War II. He's 10 years old. He watches the shows on Netflix, World War II in color. Mm-hmm. He's got just a great interest of it. All four of my children's great grandfathers, they all saw combat. 3 in the British Army, actually serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and one was the grandfather that's the subject of the book, who was British and in the U.S. Army. But we're always amazed at today how ordinary people were called to do extraordinary things during the war. So absolutely. I was having this conversation, and I suddenly remembered that my grandfather had written a book 30 years ago about it was in 1994. It was just after the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and he'd written it all down. It wasn't just about his war. It was about his early life and a bit of family history. Mm-hmm. And I knew the story, but I just decided to pick it up off the bookshelf because it wasn't a commercially published book. It was just a small book for the friends and family. And I read it through to myself, and one evening I thought, well, you know what? This would be a good film, a good movie. Mm-hmm. but realistically, not going to happen, is it?
Right.
So, yeah, and I'd always been a fan of graphic novels, and I just had this. It was during the lockdown. We had the lockdown too in the UK. Right. It was December 2020. So I did a bit of research. I bought a few books, and I just said, right, I'm going to turn his memoirs into a graphic novel. And I'm going to do it by 2022, October time, which would be his 100th birthday. And I beat my targets. So, yeah.
Good.
But actually, in more seriousness, why a graphic novel? So that was the idea. But there's the other aspect to it was they're very accessible to an audience of both adults and children. Yes. Obviously, more children, but actually adults as well. Sometimes people have 200 or 300 page books on their shelves that they're given or someone that they've been recommended, and they never read it. Right. Whereas a graphic novel you can read it in a couple of sittings, maybe one sitting. So it's not a huge investment of time, which people don't seem to have these days. Right. So that was my thought process behind it.
And I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask: was your grandfather's, were the memoirs ever published, or is it just something he wrote out, he got it out of a system, but it was just for friends and family?
It was just for friends and family.
Oh, right. Because that can be amazing as well. But I just imagine you opening this book and you're going into the world of your grandfather. We all love our grandfather, but we don't know much about when they were young. And then here you are getting to experience his perception of what the war was like.
Absolutely. I mean, so I would say the majority of the book he was writing about his factual experiences, what happened to him today. It was chronological. It was so I had to enhance the book a little bit. So it wasn't a literary work. So I had to take his experiences, and again that sort of feeds back to the graphic novel. I really wanted to evoke the era. So there's a lot that happens in the book, which we'll cover a little bit in the podcast. But essentially, he's in 1940s New York City. So this is before he enters the army, and this is just such a great era. 1940s New York. So I wanted to evoke that. I wanted to get the buildings, the signs, really just try and get as much of that atmosphere across in the book.
Absolutely. And before I ask you to introduce us to your grandfather, Bernard Sandler, I do have to let you know you're absolutely right. The graphic novel, you can just pick it up, you start looking at it, you get engaged by the photos. My youngest daughter, who is a very good artist, she draws all the time, doesn't care about World War II at all. She saw me looking through it. She sat beside me. We just went through the whole book together. It took us 20 or 30 minutes or whatever. But she loved the artwork. She loved the story. And she was like, well, why aren't there more books like this? And I'm like, she's 14. And I'm like, there very well could be if stuff like this keeps going on, because it's a great medium for such a visual story as this. But if I could get you to introduce Bernard to us and maybe take his life up to 1939, 1940, and then we can go from there.
Sure. So my grandfather was English. He grew up in a city called Leeds in northern England. He came from a very tight-knit Jewish family. He had a very comfortable middle-class upbringing. He was the oldest of 3 children. His father had emigrated at the age of 16 from Latvia. He'd escaped the old Soviet Union, it was before the Russian Revolution, and he was an immigrant. His parents had built this successful business, and he went to one of the leading schools in the city. It's called Leeds Grammar School. So he had a comfortable life. Sure. 1939. He's at school. He's 17 years old. A friend of his asks him to go on this school trip to the United States and Canada. What an exciting adventure. Now, there was probably a dilemma. Should he go on this trip or not? His parents weren't sure. Context, 1939, the war was, there was definitely something in the air. Mm-hmm. War was coming. But they took a decision to allow him to go to the US. In Canada, he had a wonderful trip. September the 3rd, 1939, just about to board his ship home, and Chamberlain had declared war. Britain had entered the war, and there was a risk of there was a risk that the boat he would be on would be sunk by U-boats. That was a very real risk, and his parents made a decision. Right. He was going to stay in the United States. They did have some contacts there, though.
Wow. That's good. I just wanted to say real quick, I did a short series on the first 6 months of the Atlantic War after Pearl Harbor, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the U-boats, America wasn't ready at all. We didn't have ships. We didn't have planes. We didn't have anything set up. And so for the first 6 months of the war, I mean, just, over 1 million tons of shipping was sunk just off the Atlantic. So he's absolutely right. If he gets on a boat, there is a decent chance he will never make it home.
Yes, and there was a very tragic story, and it was a British boat that was sunk in September 1940. That had children that were being evacuated to the United States on it. Right. So there was a genuine risk. So anyway, that was we call it in the UK sliding doors moment. There was a film called Sliding Doors where you make that decision, and it could be one way or the other. And he made that decision to, his parents and him made the decision to stay in the United States. And that, of course, changed his whole life and his whole because if he'd come home, he would have presumably fought in the British Army. So he was alone in the exciting metropolis of New York City in 1939.
Yes, I love the way you convey that in the book. I'm a simple country boy. I grew up on military bases, so something like New York or Los Angeles or London would be very intimidating to me. And here's this 18-year-old guy in the heart of America, one of the biggest cities in the world. I mean, hopefully, this is going to sound whatever, but hopefully he had a good time. I mean, he is in the Big Apple, where a lot of people go to have a good time.
Yeah, this is a coming of age book. So he starts out as a 17-year-old. He's innocent. He's lonely.
Right.
He's with these people that he's never met before. He's staying with them. He has to learn life. He's pretty stoic. He goes to school. He starts getting summer jobs. He works as a bellboy in the Catskills. He works in various jobs, but and that helps pay for his education at NYU. So yeah, he ultimately he had a good time. But I think what this book has a lot of is turning points. It's an emotional journey, ups and downs. So just as he's past one turning point, another, there's highs and lows everywhere.
Right. So he's going to clubs, he's getting a job, he's going to school, he's taking it seriously. Even though he's separated from his family, life does go on. I'm sure there are certain things that were expected of him. But you're absolutely right. Now that I think about it, when I read the book, the emotional roller coaster, the journey that you took me on was absolutely amazing. And yes, there are decisions that he makes which will affect his life, will affect other people's lives. And so you kind of don't think about it too much about making decisions like this, because you might freeze up and not ever decide anything, but he has to make some kind of decision. So he's going to college, he's listening to music, he's taking in shows, it's the New York experience, and at the same time, there's always meeting the first love of your life.
Indeed. He met my grandma, or grandma-to-be, at NYU, and she was a keen art student. And yeah, they discovered life together. They had a great, it took them a while, but yeah, he discovered his first love. But yeah, in terms of these turning points, I think he, after having, he'd reached a point where he was having a happy life. Right. Pearl Harbor happened, we all know, so December 1941, and it's. Then the U.S. government changes the rules. The draft comes into effect, and that age gets lowered and lowered And then on the 30th of June, 1942, every person born between a certain date, so I think he was included in this draft, I think it was called the fifth draft, he, on the 30th of June, 1942, he enters in a very hot and humid Washington, D.C. He is enrolled for the draft. He doesn't know when he's going to enter the Army. And then 1943, he joins basic training at Fort Dix. And that, for him, was quite a change. Right. From what was his comfortable life in New York.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think from going from Leeds to New York, now in the Army where he's going to be told what to do all the time. Could I ask real quick, when I got to that part of your book, I thought it was neat because, of course, there were going to be people of other nationalities trapped in the United States or trapped wherever when war breaks out. Do you have an idea of how many British citizens? And it's okay if you don't, because it's just off the top of my head. But I was just wondering how many British citizens probably served in the U.S. Army being over here at the time of Pearl Harbor. And you're right, they couldn't go back. It would have been too dangerous.
Yeah, I haven't found any any other examples of it, but I've just some basic Googling. I had a recent feature article in the Times of Israel that was published a couple of weeks ago, and in that article they did a bit of research, and they reckoned that there was actually quite a sizable amount of U.S. soldiers who were not born in the U.S., and of those, a certain amount of them were born in the U.K. or Britain, it was known at the time. So, but whether they would have been British is another thing. Maybe they would have been coming through because there was a lot of migration at that time. So, I would have thought for the most part he was mixing with true Americans, join the Army, and that's you have to adopt the American way.
Exactly. Could I real quick? So as we say in America, I'm sure other countries say it as well. His ass now belongs to the Army. They're going to do whatever they want, and the Army decides that they need more engineers. So guess what? He's now going to train to be an engineer.
Exactly. So this is what I was talking about, the turning points. So after his 11 weeks of basic training at Fort Dix, he's asked to sit an intelligence test, and he passes that test, which is a great success because the U.S. government decided that they were going to train 100,000 of their soldiers to become engineers. And they were then sent across the whole range of universities, I think 100 universities or colleges across the U.S. And essentially at that point, he was having a good time. I don't think any of these people thought they were going to join the war. And it's actually just a little segue. I was reading a book about the war last night that came in, and it's actually of all the U.S. soldiers that served in World War II, I mean, there was probably about 16 million of them. I can't remember the exact one, but it was a smaller percentage than you would think actually served in combat. It was actually a lot of them were actually in the U.S. So he was there, and he went from Pennsylvania to North Carolina up to Vermont, and he made some great friendships. And, ultimately, I didn't get it from his book, but I got it from the research of other books that they didn't think they were going to serve. So the next, this program, by the way, is called the ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And some very famous people were part of this program, including the likes of the comedian Mel Brooks, Bob Dole, the U.S. presidential candidate and former U.S. senator. He was part of the ASTP. And everyone has the same story. It was February 1944. Overnight, the United States government decided they didn't need to have them as engineers anymore. They'd run out of troops, or they certainly had more casualties than they'd been expecting. And suddenly, overnight, they made this decision that their lives were going to change. They were now going into combat. And that was quite that was really something that was quite a shock to them.
You mentioned earlier about this is a book, a series of turning points, and you're absolutely right. I mean, he's a kid, he's a teenager, he's not even 20, and his life has already changed so many times, and a lot of it beyond his control. But now he's going to, put the books down. Here's a gun. It's time for you to go into, learn how to shoot again, because it's probably been a while in war games. So could you tell us some about that period after he's no longer studying to be an engineer?
Sure. So at this point, just to finish on that, there was a great quote from someone called Victor Lundy. He said, "We were handpicked. We were the intellectual kids. We were supposed to graduate as captains in the engineer corps. We're helping to rebuild Europe and assess the damage after the war was over. And then the unthinkable happened. The army pushed to get men into the ASDP. We were promised to go to the OCS after training or to positions appropriate to their courses." So I think there was just can't emphasize enough this turning point was such a shock to them. There was also a little bit of resentment. There was the feeling that these people were mollycoddled a little bit. And I think somebody else called Robert Kotlowitz wrote, "The Army Specialized Training Program couldn't last. We sort of knew that. After 2 months, Congress voted it out of existence under sharp pressure from rebellious constituents who claimed we were being coddled. It was the old populist cry of elitism." So there was it was an election year, of course, 1944. So maybe that had something to do with it.
Good point.
Yeah. So he then went back to Tennessee. So the Tennessee maneuvers, and he was out doing war games. And what was particularly prominent was he was doing these marches. And I've read a lot of other memoirs, and they were doing the same things. They were marching for up to 12 hours through the night, and it was just grueling. Sometimes they were doing these marches during the day in the Tennessee or North Carolina. He was in under duress heat. So it was a real. A really, really shocking time for them, having given that they were studying only a few months earlier.
Yeah, I don't know what the average temperature in the summer is in London or in Leeds, but in North Carolina, it's going to get over 100 and stay there, and it's going to be very humid because I'm from South Carolina, right next to it, and we didn't even own winter coats. That's how mild the winters can be there. So I imagine he was sweating and suffering a lot, but you do what the Army tells you to. And so I think it's September of 44 that he finally crosses the Atlantic and he lands in France.
Exactly. So again, the turning points come through. So during the summer of 1944, they're doing the training. Again, it's grueling, but they're in the United States. They're not in the Pacific. They're not in Europe. And they missed D-Day. D-Day had happened. They come up to New York, and they are the first infantry troops to go directly from the United States into the European theater. Now, one of the things I wanted to really get across in the book was this voyage. They were leaving New York City on the 27th of August, 1944. So pretty much, we're in that. It was a 9-day trip. Now, usually it takes 5 days, I think. Now, they had to go at the speed of the slowest vessel. There were lights off during the journey. So it would have, if you think about the lifestyles we have today, where we're on digital devices all the time, these guys would have been, none of that, of course. I mean, and lights off. They were lucky if they got to play cards. They were just rammed into these ships, and they were going on this adventure, or they didn't know what they were expecting on the other side. So I could imagine that 9-day journey, the tension that they would have had during that time.
And it might have felt a lot longer than 9 days with practically nothing to do. Like you said, it's not like you can smoke too much because they have the blackout. You can't play cards because of the blackout. I imagine those 9 days felt like an eternity for some of them.
I can imagine. Yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to get these details across in the book, really capture the pictures. And one of the lucky discoveries I had. So obviously my grandfather's memoirs are my primary source, but there is somebody called Victor Lundy. Victor Lundy is still alive. He's 99 years old. He lives in Dallas. He's a very famous architect, and he was in the 26th Division, as was my grandfather. Victor Lundy sketched every part of his time in the army, from basic training through to the voyage, all the way through to combat in France. Wow. These sketches were donated to the Library of Congress about 5 or 6 years ago. You can download them online. A couple of people have put them into books. Beautiful, beautiful sketches. He then went on to become, as I said, a famous architect after the war. But these sketches were just so evocative. There's a lot of photographs of World War II you can get online, but there were none of the specifics of my grandfather's journey, of course. But this was the next best thing. That's so perfect. There are a couple of those sketches, including the front cover, which I've used, and I show that in the book at the end.
If I could real quick, and we should probably say this to the end, and I apologize for not bringing it up earlier because I have it written right here. I somehow went right over it. I guess once we're done with the story, we could probably back up a little bit and you can tell us about the artist that you used, because when I first saw this, I assumed that you had drawn it, but I think you brought in someone that you felt more comfortable with.
We'll talk about Brian. Yeah, we can talk about that.
Cool.
Absolutely. So yeah, you wanted to ask about so they arrive in Cherbourg on the September the 7th, 1944. Interesting, what I picked up for some of the other memoirs that I read is Patton did not want them to go straight into combat. So when they arrived, they actually some of them went around about as tourists looking at where the D-Day landings took place. Right. He really wanted them to sort of rest up, learn the surroundings for a few weeks. So they arrived and there was quite a fortunate time to arrive. Remember, Paris had been liberated. That side of France was pretty safe. So again, they were. As I said, more turning points, but he was in France, but he was pretty much it was training, it was acclimatization, but then the 26th Division that he was part of was moved over to the other side of France towards the Rhine, and they joined up with Patton's Third Army, and. I read a number of memoirs because my grandfather captured some of it, and I pretty much get as much as he was able to give, because it was pretty brutal times that he was fighting under. But yeah, I mean, people were killed it was horrific. And not only was it just horrific fighting, the weather was pretty horrific as well.
Yeah, I just imagine this young guy, in New York, seeing the sights. Then he goes to basic training. He was going to be an engineer, and now he's not. He gets over there, and again, he's still a kid. It's not like he's seen a whole bunch of deprivation, as far as I know. And now he's just, he's seen blood and guts and death and mercilessness. And he, like everybody else, he has to endure. He has to adapt, and I guess he does to a certain point. But then the war comes personally for him, and he gets wounded as well.
Yeah, and my grandfather would be the first to say that he had a very happy and fortunate life. He was born into a good family, and he was lucky in the fact that he survived the war. We do note one of his friends was a friend that he met in in training, called John Ebert, was killed he was from Ohio. And there's a little segue, and I do mention it in the book. There is an organization called Stories Behind the Stars that you may be aware of. It is trying to write a biography of every single soldier, United States soldier that was killed in World War II.
Wow.
So yeah, if you haven't heard of Stories Behind the Stars, I'd look it up. It's run by somebody called Don Milne, and he has so far, I think, got about 20. They've written about 20,000 so far. So I was determined that this individual, John Ebert, that there should be a biography written for him. As my grandfather had mentioned him in the book. And I managed to locate somebody called Hudson Louis from Medina, Ohio. And it turned out and I found him online. These days he's a college kid, but he's into World War II research, and he ended up being a distant cousin of John Ebert.
Right.
So it was such a coincidence. He wrote the biography, and we did get an article written in the Bridgeport, Ohio, in the local paper when the book came out. And some of his family members found out about it. So that was my way of paying a very small tribute back to John Ebert, who was killed.
Absolutely. Friends are more precious than anything else, especially when you lose them. Could you describe his the day that he got wounded?
So you would have to read in the book. I don't want to get to too much detail. Otherwise, essentially it's in some ways it was quite innocuous. He just happened to get hit by shrapnel, and then one day that's it. His war's over. Right. It was a sense of relief, if anything. He was probably in combat for about a month, and I think he was the lucky one. The 26th Division, and I've been part of a Facebook group of children and grandchildren of veterans of the 26th Division, and they went on to join Patton's army, and they went on and fought valiantly in the Battle of the Bulge, and then went on to liberate one of the concentration camps from the Holocaust. So they had quite an epic World War II adventure, the 26th Division. But of course, his war was cut short. He was flown to England, to an American military hospital, and at that point, he was he had to recuperate. And there is a little bit in the book, again, I won't go into too much detail, but there is a quest to be reunited with his family. He hadn't seen.
Right, absolutely. How could he not? But before we leave the war, you were saying that he was in combat, roughly for about a month. But given that time period and everything he probably saw, that month was probably with him for the rest of his life. So he's tried to contact his family. He's got good news. He's alive. He is wounded, but also he has met a young lady back in New York or somewhere in America, and he wants to tell his family about his plans for her.
Yeah, and this is the amazing thing. He hasn't seen his family in 6 years, but he's wants to inform them that he's now, if he survives the war, which he had done, he was going back home to marry his sweetheart, and it's a lovely sort of conclusion to the story. And in some ways, it's the start of the story because it's the start of his new life. But of course, 1945 was the record number of marriages, I think, in U.S. history. Right. So he wasn't alone.
And because we want to leave some things out for the readers, we can leave out the drama with her family because it's time of war, and when young people fall in love and they say they want to get married, I think a lot of parents are like, okay, slow down, especially in the middle of a war. So we can leave that for the people. But he does end up getting married, and they do decide to move back to England, to the UK, in September of 1946, a year later.
Yeah, and I've always been curious as to why they did that. Now, as I was saying at the start, he came from a very close, tight-knit family, Jewish family in northern England. He had such a bond with them. He wanted to make up for lost time. My grandmother and his wife-to-be, Toby, wanted an adventure. So they decided to go and live in England. And a couple of years later, my father was born. And then a couple of years after that, my aunt was born. And they made a home for themselves. He was part of a community there. He had a family business there. He lived the majority of the rest of his life in England. But he did have very strong bonds with the United States, and they would go back at least once a year to visit family and friends.
If I could for a second, because this is the part of your book that fascinated me. I mean, obviously war is horrible. You want to be able to forget about it, move on as fast as you can. But it seems to me that they find each other, they fall in love, they get married, they decide to move back to the UK. But his time in New York did make an impression upon him. Not that I know his politics before he went to New York, but obviously New York is very liberal, it's very progressive. There's the arts, there's the music scene, and I think a lot of that stuck with him. Even though it's years later, he's been through a war, and now he's back in the UK. That part of him, it seems like it was still there.
Yeah, that was very much part of him. So I would say his family's politics were probably quite conservative, as they would with that sort of middle-class suburban mindset. But he became pretty liberal when he was in New York, and that stayed with him for the rest of his life. So that it did have quite a profound impact on him. His time in New York City, but I think more. I mean, his politics was one thing, but the probably the most important thing was his love of the theater and the arts. I mean, New York City was, and still is in some ways, the mecca of the theater, and that was his great love. And he was able in the early 1970s to start off a theater that's still around today called the Leeds Playhouse. And he founded that. And that was based upon his experiences in New York for the early part of World War II when he was alone and he was discovering theater. He went to see Louis Armstrong play, which is captured in the book. Louis Armstrong live in New York in 1940. What an experience.
Yeah, as I'm going through this book, I'm like, he's so young, but he's done so much. Not that it was all of his choosing. Obviously, he's swept up in the history of time, like we all do. But so he's been to New York, he's been to war, he's married now, he's got a family, and he takes his love of theater and he brings it back home with him. So I do want to save the rest of the book for the audience, but again, I can't, even though it's a graphic novel and people might have some preconceived notions, I mean, you do cover the family's history, you've got information on the Yankee division, details of his journey over to France, the campaign that he fought in, experiences as a Jew serving in the U.S. Army, his time in the hospital, and all the various people that he meets. And there's, like you said, there's tons of photos, there's a timeline at the back, so it really did bring it all together. It was a very emotional, how should I put this? It was a very fun but emotional journey to take reading your book. And I will let you have the last word if there's anything else you wanted to add, whether it's graphic novels, whether it's the artist, whether it's your experience putting this all together. But if there's anything else that you would like to add, I would certainly appreciate it. Yeah,
there's a couple of so one it's interesting when I wrote this. Whenever I read a book or watch a movie, a biopic, I'm always on Wikipedia. I want to know as much information afterwards. I want to know what happened. I don't want the story to end. So therefore, I because it was my book, I did probably a very extensive epilogue. I really wanted to explain to everybody who reads the book. I didn't want to leave anything out. So that's why there's quite an extensive epilogue explaining not only what happened to each person, what where I got the information from, in case anyone wants to do further research, because there were scenes that I added to the book that were taken from other memoirs. So I wanted to sort of get that across. The other thing I wanted to mention was I do have there is a little flashback in the book to Latvia in the 1930s. So my great-grandfather, that's Bernard's father, he was from Latvia, left in 1910, and he, as he said, he assimilated into British life, but he left behind his family in Latvia. And in 1937, 2 years before the outbreak of the war, he decides he's going to go back to his homeland and persuade his family to come back. And he takes Bernard on that trip. And that trip is also captured in the book. And the reason he was prompted by the fact that Bernard is sitting in New York in like 1941, June 1941, and he reads in the newspapers that the Germans have invaded Russia.
Right.
And he's suddenly worried about his family. And that sort of brings into context the global nature of World War II. And, whilst Bernard had a very lucky escape in some ways, he came through the war unscathed, and his father was back home in England, and we talk about his experiences. The family in Latvia had, unfortunately, a very varied and mixed experiences, and we talk about that in the book, including some of the family were ultimately killed in the Holocaust, although his grandmother survived, having been exiled to Siberia, which was quite fascinating.
Thank you very much for that. Could you tell us about your illustrator? Yeah,
so when I said about this journey right at the beginning, I had to decide, am I going to do it myself? I'm an okay drawer, but I'm not quite at the quality needed to do it justice. Right. So I went online. I searched for about I put an advert and about 50 or 60 people applied. But there was one advert that struck me. It was from Brian Bicknell. He's from a place called Ipswich, Massachusetts. And he wrote the most beautiful email back to me, and I decided that he's going to be the one for me. The way in which we worked was I had a very good idea about every single page and how it was going to be formulated. Sure. I researched, I found photographs of the genre, I mocked it up, I drew it out myself, and then I gave it to Brian. And Brian just did such a great job. One of the things I really just wanted to make it real, and hopefully that comes across.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking at the cover now, and the buildings and the two GIs who are leaning against the railing. I mean, it just captures what the men looked like in those uniforms back then. So I just let him know he did a great, I'm sure you know this already, but he did a fantastic job, and he really helped pull this together.
I will do. Certainly pass that on.
No, it's absolutely great. So I want to, again, thank you for your time. Please feel free to add anything else that you want. But for the listeners out there, this is the English GI World War II graphic memoir of a Yorkshire schoolboy's adventures in the United States and Europe. I really enjoyed this very much, Mr. Sandler. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for this book. I certainly do encourage everyone to get it. It was a great experience to sit down with my daughter and share the story of World War II, this person's life, and, of course, the amazing artwork that went with it.
Thank you so much, Ray, for allowing me the opportunity to be on today, and wish you luck for future broadcasts.
Thank you.
At Clean Choice, we believe the best parts of this world are the simple things. How do we help protect it for future generations? The good news is that it's never been easier to help preserve those simple joys with Clean Choice Energy. Switching to clean electricity is one of the simplest and biggest ways you can help the environment. There's no new equipment needed, no home visit necessary. It only takes 2 minutes to sign up. Visit cleanchoice.com/podcast to learn how simple clean energy can be. That's cleanchoice.com/podcast.